Hello and welcome to Art is for Everyone. And this episode is going to be another little watercolor project on our Strathmore watercolor postcards. And I have been reading the most beautiful book. It's The Art of Beatrix Potter, whom I love. And it's a wonderful biography, but also has tons and tons of paintings. I highly recommend this book if you like her art. But I thought, since I was reading this and so in love with it right now, that I would paint a bunny with you. So we're not going to paint a Peter Rabbit bunny, but just a bunny, a wonderful little bunny. You could certainly put clothes on him if you'd like. But Beatrix Potter also painted bunnies with just their fur. So anyways, I'm inspired by her right now and I would like to try that. So we're going to be using the Strathmore watercolor postcards. Also, I have my wild thorn paints, and we'll mostly be using the buff Titan and the yellow ochre leger and the raw umber. And then I have my Sennelier 000 squirrel mop, and I have a mechanical pencil. I think it's an HB lead. I have an eraser nearby and some water. And I'm also going to use, if I can find it, my Pigma Micron fineliner in 005 for just some details around the eye. That's a waterproof permanent archival ink in black. And the first thing we're going to do is draw the bunny. So I'm going to move my watercolors and water and such out of the way. So I have a little more room, and I'll probably tilt my paper when I draw because it's just easier for me to get a good angle. I'm left-handed and I write like this, so it's easier for me to draw if I turn my paper. So I recommend that you turn your paper in whatever way it's comfortable for you. I find that I like to pull my lines toward me when I'm painting or drawing, so it's easier for me this way. If it's like this, I'm kind of moving my hand, so I just like to turn my paper. And we're going to start, just like always, with simple shapes. And so the first thing I'm going to do for my bunny is I'm going to draw a little egg shape for his head. And using just a soft pencil line, I'll draw an egg shape. And the egg is sort of kind of at an angle. So if you look at it upright, it's like this, okay? And then I'm going to connect his head with just a line kind of from the back of the egg straight down. Okay, so it's about even with the bottom of the egg shape. And then I'm going to draw another one about here. Okay, and then I'm going to draw just a little slope that connects those two lines. And then I'm going to draw another oval, but kind of out this way. Okay, and then for his little feet, it's just a rectangle that comes off of his body. And then on the front of him, I'm going to pull out a little line, sort of a rectangle here for his paw. Okay, so those are my basic shapes: the egg shape, the lines coming down from the egg shape, then another oval for the body, and then this little rectangular shape with the rounded end here, and the same over here. Now, that is enough to get started, but we want to refine that a little bit, and we also have to add his ears. So I'm going to basically just connect all of these lines together. I think I'll make him a little bit chubbier. And then kind of give him a curve down here. Okay, and then where his face comes out, I think I'll make the egg shape a little bit pointier. I should have in the first place, but that's the nice thing about pencil. So you see, I'm just sort of connecting all of these shapes together with a contour line, a line that kind of goes all the way across. everything. And I think I'll make his body come out a little bit more. Let's put his foot a little bit farther out. So that's about it. And then I can add just a little circle here for his cottontail at the back of his body. And then for his ears, I'm going to start with a line that kind of goes almost straight up. And bring it back down. And then I'll start down here on his head. And I'll make another oval shape. And extend that ear up just a little bit. Okay, so these are just basic shapes. And what you can do is you could even screenshot the video if you'd like to, and then just print out my drawing if that would help you to see something. So now we're going to add some features to him. And I'm going to add just a little shape here for his nose. Okay. And then if I look at his face, I'm just going to make his forehead a little bit bigger like that. And then I'm going to go back from the top of his nose about 2/3 of the way and put a little dot, and then a little dot maybe about halfway. And then I'm going to make a circle. Okay? And I want him to have a little catch light in his eye, so I'm just going to draw a little half circle up here on the top to remind me where I want that to be. And that is all I have to do for my drawing. So once that is done, I'm going to use an eraser and I'm going to clean up my sketch. And I'll just take this is just a stick eraser, and I'm going to erase any of the extra lines where I overlapped things. Okay, so I'm just erasing the extra lines. And just cleaning up my drawing a little bit. Most of these lines will get absorbed into the painting and we won't see them anymore. But just in case, I just like to take an eraser. You could also use a kneaded eraser, any kind of white plastic eraser as well, just to clean it up a bit. And then I'll use a brush just to brush the eraser dust off my paper. There's a piece that's stuck. Okay, perfect. Okay, so our drawing is now finished, and we will get back to painting. So I'm going to bring back my supplies. I'm also going to use a little bit of a color called Wood Rose for the inside of his ear, I think, and that is in another palette, so I'll just bring that over once I'm ready to use it. So we're going to start with his eye, and I'm going to use my fineliner, okay? I'm going to tilt my paper again, and I'm basically just going to put a little dot on the corner of his eye and a little dot on the other corner, and then I'm going to outline his eye with the black ink. You know, it doesn't have to be real thin, it can be kind of thick. And then I also want to outline that catch light. So that's going to remind me not to paint in that little white area when I paint his eye. Okay? All right, so I'm going to let this ink dry for a minute just so we don't have any chance of it smudging, and then I will be back. Okay, so the ink is dry, and now we are going to paint, and we're going to start with just a glaze of watercolor to create the shape of the bunny. So it's like a first layer, and we're going to use Buff Titan, and I'm going to put it in my palette, get a good amount of it in here, and I'm going to put it in my palette with a little water so it's nice and juicy, nice and fluid. And then I'm also going to create a little puddle of raw umber. This beautiful rich brown. This color has amazing granulation properties, and it'll be perfect for our furry little bunny. Make sure I have a nice amount of water in there. Okay, and I'm also going to pick up some of the ochre léger as well and put that in my palette. You can tell what colors I use the most, huh? This one's really getting down there. Okay, so I've got some ochre léger. Now, I'm going to start with a water glaze, and the reason we start with a water glaze is to give our pigments a nice smooth surface to flow on, and it allows us to create these subtle transitions in color. So I'm going to start with his body, and don't mind me if I turn my paper, but I'm going to use the clear water, and I'm just going to paint his body up to his head. Put a nice reservoir on it. It's okay if your water's a little bit tinted, that's fine. It actually is helpful as long as it isn't too dirty. So I'm being careful here around the edges, but I'm just making sure I've got a nice glaze of water on his body. I'm going to go ahead and include his little feet. Okay, so you see I'm just turning my paper around. I'm not going to paint his tail yet. So take it right out to the end of his paw, his bottom paw. So now I have a water glaze over the entire body area. Okay, leave his head for another step. Okay, so now that I have that, I'm going to pick up my Buff Titan and I'm going to drop it in right under his face, and see I'm just touching my paintbrush to his body, okay? And I'm bringing it all the way down to his foot, and then just a little bit on the bottom of his paw there. And just dropping it in around the top of his body down to his foot, and then down here, and a little bit on his bottom foot. And I'm just letting that pigment just kind of move around in the way it wants to. Then I'm going to pick up the ochre léger, and I'm going to touch a little bit here where his paw meets his body. I'm going to touch a little bit down here where his body meets his foot. And I'm just going to put a little bit in here, kind of in the center of his body. Just drop it in. You don't even have to be really specific about it, but just sort of in the center area here. Okay? And I'm also going to put a little bit of that, just a tiny bit, right up here in the back of his head. So you can see already that the paints are starting to spread around and kind of mix together. Then I'm going to take the raw umber, stir it up, and I'm going to drop some raw umber, right under his face. And just a little bit, just kind of right up here. Okay, then pull it down, sort of under where his paw meets his body. And then start up here at the top of his back and pull this color down his body. All the way to his tail and all the way to the bottom of his body. Okay, so now we have a layer of paint on, and what I'm going to do is clean my brush, dry it, and roll it to a point, and then I'm going to go around the edges with the tip of my brush to sort of coax that paint to the very edge. And this gives me a nice clean line. Okay, and it also sort of coaxes the paint to come to the edge. All right, and I'll just keep turning him. So remember, I want to get that good angle with my brush, pull it toward me. That's what works best for me. You can try all different angles, but for me it works best if I pull the paint toward me. So I'm being very careful. I'm using the tip of my brush. Going around all of the edges, making sure that I have a nice clean edge all the way around. This takes some practice. So remember my little saying, the first time we do something we learn, the second time we do it we practice, and the third time we have a much better idea of what we're doing, and things usually go better the third time. So now that I've gone around the edges, I'm going to take my brush, which has also been cleaned and dried, rolled to a point again, and I'm going to start just sort of flicking the paint where the colors meet one another. So especially the raw umber, anywhere that it meets other colors, I'm just sort of taking my brush and flicking it to encourage the paint to move around a little bit and sort of transition from one color to the other. So you just want it to be sort of soft. With these granulating pigments, this also helps just to sort of move the paint around so it sort of flocculates, which is a wonderful word, isn't it? Flocculate. So it sort of flocculates and settles into the grooves of the paper, the texture of the paper. There. Okay, and I see I've got a little bit of pooling here, so I'm going to dry my brush off, and I'm just going to stick the very tip of my brush in there, and that'll wick some of that up, so now it's not so wet. A lot of times if we leave those really wet edges, what will happen is when the paint dries, it will dry with a very hard edge, and we don't necessarily want that. So I'm going to clean my brush, dry it off one more time, and I'm just going to run around this edge on the front of his body one more time, just sort of soften it. My pencil line, because it's so light there, is kind of obvious, so when this dries, I'll try to use an eraser there and see if that helps. Okay, so we don't want to move to his tail and his head just yet, because if we do, the paint that we apply there will rush into his body because this is still wet. So once again, I'm going to turn off the video, let this dry, and then I'll be back. Okay, so now his body is dry, and we're going to do the same thing we did here, but for his head. Now, this may seem a little fiddly that you have to keep stopping to waiting for the paint to dry, but what I usually do is do the dishes or make a cup of coffee or, just something else. I work on another drawing. It's just really important with watercolor. It's one of those things we just have to get used to. So we're going to go ahead and do his head now. And I'm going to turn him upside down. I hope that doesn't throw you too much. And going to start his head the same way I did his body with a water glaze. All right, so I can paint right over his nose if I want to, because his nose will be dark. So I'm going to put the water glaze down. And I'm going to avoid his eye. I'm just going to paint around it. And if we wouldn't not have let the ink dry for a while, it might run. They dry fairly quickly, but I have made the mistake of painting too soon, and the eye will run. The ink will run into the painting. So we don't want that. It's always a good idea. I am going to avoid where his ear comes down and just put a little bit of water up in there, because we'll do his ears separately with it when we do his tail. And I'm just putting this water glaze down all over his head. Otherwise, again, avoiding the ears. So it's just his little head. Avoiding the eye. And you notice that I keep turning my paper to make it easier on myself. Okay, I have a nice water glaze down, and now I'm going to do the same thing and drop those pigments in. So we'll start again with a little bit of the Buff Teton, and we're just going to drop that right around his eye, on the back side of his eye, okay? And then we're going to drop a little bit where his ear meets his head. And then we'll go right into the yellow ochre, and I'm going to keep the yellow ochre around the edges of his head, down to his nose. You don't have to go over his nose. And then down here, where his face meets his body, his head meets his body, okay? And then a little bit back here behind his ear. All right, so that's it for the yellow ochre. Actually, you know what? I'll bring it right up here into the top of his head. So it's basically, you're basically just rimming the outside of his face, okay? And then I'll go right into my raw umber. And if your paints have dried on your palette, all you have to do is reconstitute them with a little bit of water, and they'll be fine. Then I'll just use the raw umber and drop in, just lightly drop it in all of the other areas. Okay, so it looks kind of mottled, but that's what we want. We want that sort of mottly fur texture. I'm going to rinse my brush and roll it to a point, and then once again I'm going to take the tip of my brush and run it around the edges to make sure that the paint moves to those edges cleanly. Nice clean edge. And if my paintbrush starts to get a little bit too wet, I just roll it on my paper towel again. I have a little roll of paper towels up here, and I'm just rolling it on the paper towels. Okay, just taking the tip of my brush all the way around his head. Okay, once again, I'll clean my brush, roll it, and let me just show you what that looks like. So here's my paper towels. I just keep a roll of paper towels, and I sort of flatten them down, and I just use it so it doesn't roll. And then when this gets dirty and it's dry or whatever, I just take off the dirty piece and I have a fresh piece underneath. So when I say I roll my brush, I'm basically taking my brush and just rolling it on the paper towel. And what this does, it does two things. It wicks the water out, and it brings your brush back to a nice fine point. Okay, so that's what I'm doing when I say I'm rolling my brush. So I don't need to do too much coaxing here, but I will take the tip of my brush and sort of feather here and there if I see that it needs it. But I think it's pretty good. Okay, all right, so our head is done. Once again, I'm going to turn off the video, let this dry, and then when I come back, we're going to do the ears and the tail, and then we can start putting some detail on the bunny. We'll do his nose as well, and then we'll also paint the eye. Okay, see you in a bit. Okay, so our bunny is now dry, these two layers, and we're going to move on to his ears and his tail and his eye. So I'm going to start his ears. I'm not going to put too much water on, but I am going to start with a little water glaze, okay? And I won't go all the way to the edge. And the reason why is I want the edge of his ears to be a little bit darker. So I'm putting the water glaze down. I'm going to take it right down here to the bottom. And I'll go ahead and do the other one at the same time because they're so small. They won't take too much time. So just kind of in the center. And then I'm going to use the wood rose, the water rose. And I'll just grab a little bit of that, not too much because we want it pretty pale. Put it into my palette, make sure it's nice and juicy. That's pretty good. And I'm going to put that right in the center of his ear. Just this one in the front because the back one we wouldn't see the inside of his ear. So we've got a little bit of that in there, and then I'll use the yellow ochre, the ochre léger, and I'm going to drop that around the edge. They can mix together. You actually want that. Turn my paper a little bit. And I'll bring the yellow ochre right down to where his ear meets his body. Okay? And then I'm going to do the same on the other side with the yellow ochre. So you see how I left the edge just white between them, so they won't run together. And I'll drop the yellow ochre on this ear. Okay? But I'm not taking it all the way to the edge because we're going to do that with some raw umber for when we do the finishing touches. So that's all I will do for his ear now. Actually, I changed my mind. I can do that. And I'm going to take just a tiny bit of raw umber and drop it at the top of this ear. Just a little touch, just to make it a little bit darker up there. Okay, so his ears are done for now. We don't even have to run our brush around the edges because we're going to put a darker color around there. Okay, and now I'm going to do his tail. And for his tail, I'm just going to put down a little water. And I'm going to grab my ochre léger and drop it in to the center. And then dry my brush off a little. And I'm going to use the raw umber to paint around the edges. And I'm using the tip of my brush because I don't want it to be too smooth and even. There. That's a little too much paint, so I dried my brush off and I'm going to stick the tip of my brush in and let it wick some of that up. So do you see how I use the tip of my brush so it's not even? I realize that a lot of bunnies have white tails, but mine's going to have a brown tail. Okay. Now, the ears are done, the tail is done, okay, and I can even just soften that a little bit right here. There. So now I'm going to paint the eye. Now, the bunny's eyes are really, really dark brown, so I'm going to grab more of the raw umber and add it to my palette. Pretty strong. I don't necessarily want to put too much water in it for this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the tip of my brush and I'm going to paint the inside of the eye. But I'm going to avoid where that catchlight is. Remember how we reserved that little half circle? I'll paint right up to that. And once I have a layer down and it's wet, I can take the raw umber again and I can just drop it in, and I'm going to focus right under that catchlight and then pull it up and around. So it makes it nice and dark, okay? And when we were doing the final touches after this portion is over, we'll go in with our marker again and put some more black in there, okay? So that is his eye, just a nice dark brown. I usually start with one glaze and then drop in more. It's just a little bit easier that way. And then I can go right to his nose. And I'm just going to take my brush and sort of rim the shape of his nose and just fill it in a little bit. So his nose has a little, I don't know if you can see that in here, but I left a little space where his nose would have that little part where it kind of goes up in the middle. All right, I'm going to add a little bit more of the raw umber to his tail just on the very edges, just kind of flick my brush. I don't know if you can see that. Just flick my brush around the edges while I have this raw umber on my brush. Okay, all right, now his feet, we can go ahead and put some details right now while the other parts are drying. So I'm going to use the raw umber. I'm actually going to add a little more water to it because it's starting to dry. And I don't want it terribly dark, but about mid-tone. And I'm going to dry my brush off with the paint on it so it's not terribly wet. It has paint on it, but I've kind of soaked up the extra water. And what I'm going to start to do is to put little tiny details on him. So I'm going to be using the tip of my brush again. And I'm holding the brush really close to the end so I have a lot of control. And I'm just going to flick little tiny marks. So it's almost like hatching and drawing. I'm just using these teeny little brush strokes. Okay? And then down here where his foot comes out, I'll do the same. And I'm going to put some of these hatch marks along the bottom of his foot. And it's okay if they go slightly off the edge. That's kind of what you want. And then I'm going to do the same to the underside of his body, the bottom of his body. I'm just flicking little tiny hatch marks with the tip of my brush. And this does a couple things. It gives us the illusion of fur, okay? But it also creates a little bit of shadow toward the bottom of his body. I'm just flicking it down there, okay? Just to create a little bit of shadow and the illusion of fur at his edges. All right, I'm also going to put a little bit of the same along his backside, and I'm going to start about halfway down, okay? And I'm going to do the same little strokes right off the edge of his body. So you see how this is not really dark, okay? It's rather light. It's about the same tone as what dried on the paper. So we're kind of creating the illusion of fur, okay? And then here, where his leg, the roundness of his leg, sort of like midway down his body, I'm just sort of flicking a few bits in here as well. And as it comes down to where his tail meets his body, I'll stop. Okay, so it just gives the illusion of that. I can even grab a little bit of the yellow ochre and then dry my brush so it's not too wet, okay? And then just take it a little bit further. All right, so that gives us the illusion that he has this kind of haunch here that will come down to his foot. And I can even pull that into his body a little bit. And then I'm going to do the same with yellow ochre. Make it a little, my little puddle here got a little brown. Dry my brush with the paint on it, and I can pull this down here as well, under where his arm would come down. Okay, so you see what we're doing. We're just kind of creating a little shape on our bunny, not too much. And I can flick little hairs here and there, kind of the direction that you think it would grow. Doesn't have to be realistic. We're just creating a sweet little bunny from our imagination. But you see how I'm using the very tip of my brush to just sort of fill in the illusion of fur. Here and there, okay? Very light, tiny little strokes, holding my brush down toward the bottom. See how I'm doing that? Little tiny flicks. I'm not even needing to refill my brush with paint because I really want very little. And I'm just sort of moving around him with this wash of yellow ochre on my brush. Okay, now I want to do the same thing to his head, and I'll start with the yellow ochre. Dry my brush off. And then I'm going to turn him this way so I've got a good angle, because his hair would grow in this direction. But I don't think it would really matter. I mean, you can just put these little flicky strokes on in the texture of fur where you see them. And it'll kind of bend around his head and go around his eye, right up to his ear. See, I'm just sort of moving around, putting these tiny little strokes. You're probably getting tired of me saying that, but I just want you to understand. And when I get to the point where his face meets his body, oops, see, I didn't dry my brush. Okay. I'm just going to let those hairs just kind of cross over. Those little strokes will cross right over that line just to sort of join them together. So I'm sort of just covering him in these tiny little brush strokes. They're like little flicks. Okay, and then I'll move toward the front of his face. All right, so that's pretty simple. Now around his eye, I'm just going to put a little definition, and I'll just grab some of the same yellow ochre paint. It's mixed in with a little raw umber. And around his eye, I'm going to use the same little flick marks and just sort of surround the outside of his eye. I'm just turning my paper so I get a good angle. There. That's a sweet little bunny. Okay, I'm going to take a little bit more of the raw umber, dry my brush off a bit, and I'm going to flick a little bit around his nose, just a teeny bit, to give the illusion of maybe some whiskers. There. Very sweet. Okay, now his ears are dry enough that we can go back in and put some of that raw umber on. So I'm going to clean my brush and start with a nice puddle of raw umber in my palette again. Nice and fluid, but I'm going to dry my brush off again. So the brush is loaded with paint, but all the extra paint has been wicked out and I rolled it to a nice fine point. And I'm going to go back up to his ears, and right sort of here at the edge of his ear, I'm just going to flick in a little paint. Okay, just to sort of rim where his ear meets his head. And I'm going to do the same over on this side. And then I'm going to start going around the edge of his ear with these little strokes. And I'm just sort of rimming his ear with these little strokes. And by doing that, I'm making them look like they've got furry little edges. And giving them a little definition. Okay? And then I'll go down to this one and do the same. Now this one, the back ear is a little bit different. So the back ear, we don't see the inside of it. So we're actually going to come down here to where it joins the head. And we're going to put those little strokes all the way up. Letting that yellow ochre shine through, but giving it sort of the texture of fur. So this little brush stroke you can practice. And by the time you do the bunny 3 times, you'll be really good at it. And it's a great one to know for when you want to do things with fur. Okay. Now the center of his ear needs a little bit of depth. So we're going to go back to the yellow ochre. Roll our brush off so it's not too wet. And then we're going to paint some bigger little strokes around the outside. Bring it all the way down here. Okay? And then I'm going to take more of the wood rose. I need a little bit more of it. Mix a tiny bit of the raw umber in there if you want to make it a little darker. And then I'm going to put a little bit of this color in the center there. You see how I just put almost like a triangle shape in the bottom of his ear where it starts to meet the body, and that just sort of gave him more definition. It made it look a little bit like it's around it. I can even pull it a little bit up here. Okay? And the outside of his ear is not dark enough to me, so I'll take a little bit more of the raw umber. And then I'm just going to flick it through again on this edge. Just to the bottom of his ear. Okay. All right, so most of our bunny is now done. Look at me. See, I'm still fiddling. I just wanted a little bit darker up there. Okay, so most of our bunny is now done, and now we're going to do the final touch, which is his eye. Do you see me still fiddling? I'm putting more dark in there. Just a little bit. Contrast is important, you know. So where things overlap, there usually is a little bit of a shadow, and so we always want to address that with our paint. I'm even going to make it a little bit darker right here with these little flick strokes where his head meets his body, just sort of in the front here. And then a little bit here at the back of his neck. And these things, you know, you can watch this video all the way through, and each time you do it, you'll see a little bit more, and you'll figure out new things to try and to do to enhance what you've already done. Okay, so now we're going to go back to his eye. And what I'm going to do, it's nice and dark, okay, so I don't need to put any more paint on it, but I am going to use my fineliner, and right in the center of his eye, underneath that catch light, with a little white space that we left, I'm going to use the tip of my brush to just make little dots to sort of stipple in a darker area here. So do you see what that did? It just gave the middle of his eye a bit of depth. Okay, so now our bunny is finished. Make sure you sign him when you're done. I'll put my monogram on him. And he is all finished. So this project was a little bit more difficult than some of the other ones that we've done. We learned a few new techniques. We learned how to make the fine hair texture to give the illusion of hair. It's a little bit more of a complex drawing that we did. So pat yourself on the back when you finish this one. This is a great next step. And I hope you will share your results with me on social media. You can find me on Facebook at Kateri Ewing Watercolors and on Instagram at Kateri Ewing. I will put both of those in the description box below, as well as a list of all the materials that we used. So I hope you enjoy painting this bunny. It would make a sweet little Easter card, I think. And I hope to see your paintings when you're done with them. Thanks again for being here, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. If you enjoyed this video, I hope that you'll subscribe to my channel so you'll get all the latest updates.